The worst affair story I've ever heard. Betrayal from husband and best friend. I've heard my fair share of cheating stories over the years, some heartbreaking, some infuriating, but there's one that stands out. One that still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it. It was a story that shook me to my core because it wasn't just about infidelity. It was about betrayal on a level that I didn't think was possible. It wasn't my story, but it might as well have been. It involved people I knew, a couple I once thought were rock solid. Their story became the worst cheating scandal I'd ever heard, and it changed the way I viewed relationships forever. It all started with a couple named Sarah and Jake. I met them through mutual friends when I moved to a new city about 5 years ago. Sarah and Jake were the kind of couple you envied, high school sweethearts, married young, and seemingly perfect for each other. They had that chemistry that made you think they were destined to be together. I remember seeing them at parties, always laughing, always in sync, and I thought, asterisk, if there's such a thing as soulmates, these two are it. Asterisk. Sarah was a nurse, hardworking and selfless, always putting everyone else's needs before her own. Jake was an entrepreneur, running a successful small business. Together, they had built a beautiful life, a nice house, 2 adorable kids, and a circle of friends who admired their relationship. They were the kind of couple that made you believe in love, the kind that seemed unshakable. But as with most stories of infidelity, what's on the surface often hides the rot underneath. And this story, it was rotten to the core. I'll never forget the day Sarah called me. It was a cold, rainy afternoon, much like the day I first met her. But this time, the light in her voice was gone. She sounded hollow, like the life had been sucked out of her. "Can we meet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to someone." I agreed, sensing something was seriously wrong. When I met her at a local coffee shop, she looked like a shell of her former self. Her usually bright eyes were dull, her face drawn and pale. She hadn't slept. That much was obvious. I didn't push her to talk right away. I just waited, knowing whatever she had to say would come out in its own time. And when it did, I was not prepared for the horror that followed. "I caught Jake cheating," she said, her voice breaking. She didn't cry, she looked too exhausted to even shed a tear. "But it's worse than you think." I was stunned. Jake? Cheating? On Sarah? It didn't make sense. They were the couple everyone admired, the couple that had it all. I wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, but I could see how fragile she was, so I just listened. She started from the beginning, telling me how she had noticed little things at first: Jake coming home later than usual, spending more time on his phone, being more distant. She chalked it up to the stress of his business, to the fact that they had 2 young kids and life was busy. But then there were the nights he didn't come home at all, saying he was staying at the office late or crashing at a friend's house after work. Sarah wanted to believe him, she needed to believe him, but something didn't feel right. So, one night, after he had left for another late night at work, she did something she never thought she'd do. She went through his phone. Jake had always been protective of his phone, but that night, he had forgotten to take it with him. Sarah had never been the type to snoop, but she couldn't ignore the growing pit in her stomach. She opened his messages, her hands trembling, and that's when she found it. The texts, dozens of them. The woman's name was Melissa, and based on the messages, it was clear that this wasn't just a fling. It had been going on for over a year. A year of lies, a year of deceit, all behind Sarah's back. But that wasn't the worst part, not by a long shot. Sarah didn't just find messages between Jake and Melissa. She found messages between Jake and someone else, someone she never expected. Her best friend, Laura. That's when the real horror began to unfold. Jake hadn't been cheating with just one woman. He had been cheating with multiple women. And some of them were people Sarah knew, close friends, women she had trusted. He had been living a double life, or rather, multiple lives, each one carefully hidden behind the facade of a perfect marriage. "I feel like such an idiot," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "How did I not see it? How did I let this happen?" I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could take away the pain she was feeling. All I could do was sit there and listen as she poured out the details of Jake's betrayal. The texts, the late-night rendezvous, the lies he had spun to cover his tracks. It was like something out of a nightmare. Only this was Sarah's reality. But it got worse. A few weeks after Sarah confronted Jake, she discovered that one of the women he had been involved with wasn't just a random fling. She was pregnant. And the worst part? Jake didn't know if the baby was his or not. Sarah was devastated. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, had not only cheated on her, but had potentially fathered a child with another woman. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that she didn't know how to move forward. Every part of her life had been touched by his infidelity. Every friendship, every relationship tainted by the knowledge of what he had done. But here's the kicker: the woman who was pregnant? It wasn't Melissa. And it wasn't any of the other women Sarah had discovered. It was Laura, her best friend, the one person she thought she could trust above all others. I sat there, staring at Sarah in disbelief as she told me the rest of the story. Jake had been having an affair with her best friend for nearly 2 years. And now, Laura was pregnant. The betrayal from Jake was bad enough. But knowing that her best friend had been complicit in the destruction of her marriage? That was a wound that cut too deep for words. I don't even know who to be more angry with, Sarah said, her voice cracking. Jake, for doing this to me. Or Laura, for pretending to be my friend while she slept with my husband. I couldn't answer that question. I couldn't even begin to understand the level of betrayal Sarah was feeling. All I knew was that this was the worst cheating story I had ever heard. And it was happening to someone I cared about. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's world continued to unravel. She filed for divorce, cutting all ties with Jake and Laura. But the damage had already been done. Every part of her life had been affected by their betrayal. She lost friends, people who didn't want to take sides. And she had to explain to her kids why their dad wasn't coming home anymore. It was a mess. Painful, gut-wrenching mess. And there was no easy way out. Sarah moved out of the house they had shared, trying to rebuild her life from the ground up. It wasn't easy. She had been with Jake for over a decade, and learning to live without him, without the security she had once known, was terrifying. But she was strong, stronger than I had ever realized. And she slowly began to put the pieces of her life back together. As for Jake, his life fell apart too. Melissa left him when she found out about the other women. And Laura? Well, she wasn't interested in playing house with him either. In the end, he was left alone, with nothing but the wreckage of the life he had destroyed. To this day, I still can't believe how it all unfolded. It was the kind of story you hear about in soap operas, the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty. But it was real. It happened to someone I knew, someone I cared about, and it left scars that will never fully heal. I think about Sarah sometimes, about how she's doing now. We still keep in touch, though not as often as we used to. She's remarried now, to a man who treats her the way she deserves to be treated. And she seems happy. But I know there's a part of her that will never fully recover from what Jake did to her. That kind of betrayal changes you, and no amount of time or love can erase the damage. As for me, I've become a lot more cautious when it comes to relationships. Seeing what happened to Sarah made me realize how fragile trust can be, how easily it can be broken. And once it's gone, there's no getting it back. So, when people ask me what the worst cheating story I've ever heard is, I think of Sarah and Jake. I think of the lies, the betrayal, the devastation. And I remember that even the people who seem to have it all can lose everything in the blink of an eye. Because sometimes, the worst cheating stories aren't just about infidelity, they're about the destruction of trust, the shattering of lives, and the pain that lingers long after the affair is over.